Okay, everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome to Natural Areas Management Services webinar, Advanced Level Training 2. My name's Agnes Kedmanets. I'm with University of Maryland Extension. I'm glad you could join us for Tree Planting and Water Week. This series, as you know, came from the Woodland Health Practices Handbook and Checklist. You may have been with us for our first series in the training. And this manual and checklist was created in the partnership of the Woods in Your Backyard Partnership. That's with the Virginia Department of Forestry, Penn State Extension, University of Maryland Extension, Virginia Cooperative Extension, and Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. This partnership and this experience has been brought to us by the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology here in Maryland. So I'm glad you guys came. Hopefully you were here for the first week for our wildlife week, where we talked a little bit about human-wildlife conflict and also alternatively how to create habitat for wildlife. And yesterday, Tuesday, we talked with the Stroud Center for Water Research Center, and they talked to us about tree plantings and some of the work that they're doing, research they're doing to find out how to have successful tree planting. So that was some great knowledge that they shared with us. So this week we're going to talk about maintaining tree planting, riparian buffers, and lawn conversion. And so that's about planning and installing any tree planting project is only the first step. Maintaining the planting for 3 to 5 years to assure good survival and growth requires controlling competing vegetation, maintaining tree shelters or fencing, and communicating with the property owners to educate them about what is required. Many planting projects have failed due to lack of maintenance, and this presentation will provide examples of what is needed for success. So before we get into it, I want to reintroduce myself. Hi, my name's Agnes, University of Maryland Extension. I'm the Woodland Stewardship Educator. I coordinate the Maryland Delaware Master Logger Program, and I also contribute to Landowner Education, along with Andrew Kling. You may remember him from Tuesday. He's also one of our co-hosts for this series, so thank you, Andrew. So I hope you guys are finding some of the benefits of registering. We appreciate all the chat that happens and all the questions and sharing of resources. And we also hope you're taking this opportunity to find out some of the other professionals in your profession. So we wanted to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. You staying on with us lets us know that you're okay with it being recorded, and we're glad that you're sticking with us. Now, I did have a question for you guys. Did you receive your manual and checklist, the Woodland Health Practices Manual and Checklist? I hope you did receive that in the mail. If for some reason you did not receive that in the mail, please contact who you registered with. Then they can send that to you promptly. All right, thank you. And if for some reason you want to share this with some of your other team members or other people that you work with, or you just want to watch it again, hey, you can get our recording at extension.umd.edu/woodland. And also don't forget, it'll get emailed to you too. So as you know, we're providing a continuing education credits for this series for International Society of Arboriculture, for Maryland Delaware Master Loggers, for Society of American Foresters, and a few more. So if you want to get continuing education credits, that's great. What's going to happen is a certificate will be emailed to you, and then you can send that to the association that you want to get credits from. So again, we're sending you the certificate, and then you can send it to where you would like to get that continuing education credit. So we're hoping that this presentation is gonna elicit some conversation, and we really encourage that. And we encourage all conversation to go in the comments icon, as you can see there. We also hope that you have questions, clarifying questions, questions about other strategies that you heard of, questions about specific situations that you may have. Please put those questions in the Q&A. What is really great about this Q&A feature is that we also have some other professionals in the background here that are part of the Woods in Your Backyard partnership. Jonathan Case, for example, from University of Maryland, Julianne from Penn State, and we have Joe from the Virginia Department of Forestry. They're going to be in the background helping out with some of that Q&A. And, you know, sometimes they put funny things in that chat. So you can keep your eye on that chat. As you know, there's going to be an evaluation at the end of the series. Your input is really important to us. It was the input from our last series that prompted some of the topics that we have in this series. So you telling us what you like, what you'd like to hear more of, or maybe you have a new topic that you are just newly exploring and you want us to talk more about that. Let us know in that evaluation that you're going to get, and we'll do our best. So this leads us to our tonight's speakers. So our first speaker tonight will be Jamie Weaver. He has worked across the country in private, academic, nonprofit, and more recently, private sector in natural resources management. Working for the Maryland Forest Service, Jamie now assists private landowners sustainably managing their properties. Then following Jamie's talk, Matt's going to join in, and Matt is from the Wright Environmental and Land Services, LLC. He's the owner of that business, and he graduated from Towson University with a degree in biology in 2000. Since then, he's been working in the environmental consulting field for about 20 years. In 2013, Matt went out on his own and started Wright Environmental and Land Services, LLC. His company specializes in wetland and forestry consulting, including wetland delineation, wetland restoration and creation, forest stand delineation and Forest Conservation Act compliance, forest management and restoration planting and maintenance. All right, you guys, I'm so glad, Jamie and Matt, that you guys could join us. Jamie, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if you're ready to start your presentation, we're glad that you guys could be here. Great.
We're all set. Everyone sees this?
Great, you're perfect. Great.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction. I do work for Maryland Forest Service. This is meant to be a talk where I'm trying to not be so centric to the state of Maryland, but rather just touch on some of these programs that stretch across and throughout the Chesapeake watershed. And I would say that the timing of this is appropriate. This has long been, as the title would say, a neglected necessity for planting maintenance. And I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of my colleagues in the state where things have changed over the years. And I've certainly given a lot of presentations, but this is the first time where this has been the sole focus of the talk. And not that it's rocket science. So I really tried to build this presentation to give it some context of the why behind the maintenance and maybe some of the impetus and why it is that not just from a requirement from a program perspective, but now why planting in this century is a lot different than planting even back in 1980. So I think just to get started and not to dwell too much on stuff, I want to make sure, like when we're talking about stuff, that we are at least using terminology that when I reference something, we understand. And for those that have gone through schooling of any sort or have gone through other like woodland steward programs, there are lots of diagrams that list riparian forests and very structured and schematics But then when we close the books and look out the windows, we start to see that these things start to take on a little bit of a different flair, that now we're looking at ribbons of woodlands that stretch through agricultural land, vernal pools, stream sides against very large order streams, or those originating out of headwaters. So then it becomes a question of how do we really define what a riparian forest is? It's interesting. I went to grad school, and in part it was because of riparian forestry is what I was really interested in. My hobbies revolve around fly fishing, so I have all kinds of vested professional and personal interests into healthy waters. And thinking about how you define riparian forests is one of these things that's almost defined in several different ways. The real estate moniker of location, location, location is certainly a very key component. Where are we in the landscape? Are we headwater streams that over stream channels we could leap over? Or are we talking about very, very large order streams, some of the major tributaries into the Chesapeake Bay itself? Certainly that has some kind of proximity from the water's edge of the terrestrial influence. So there's a scientific component. There's a lot of research that was done in Pacific Northwest that has looked at these small order riparian effects, especially as it relates to silvicultural work. And some of this work has been replicated in the Northeast. And you can get into some of these complex equations that take into account physiographic factors. There could be then, if we're starting with a blank slate, management objectives, if we're looking to stabilize a stream bank, improve aquatic habitat, or just put in place a natural filter, that actual buffer width may vary based on those management objectives. But by and large, with the programs that we'll be talking about today, and most likely the ones that you'd be working with in a professional capacity, administratively, they're defined by the funding programs. There's often a minimum criteria, a minimum width from the stream channel that is defined, and then some upper maximum. But the big takeaway, at least in terms of the presentation that we're carrying forward today, is that we have these narrow strips or maybe wider strips of vegetation that are adjacent to water bodies. And so this is then to set everything into context. And I preface this whole little spiel in this slide that I'm a field forester, so I am way down the food chain when it comes down to some of the administrative aspects of this and what the targets are. But I think that this is extremely important because this is really what is the genesis for a lot of the planting programs, and certainly the genesis for the need to have a standardized maintenance program for plantings. So it's called the Watershed Implementation Plan. That's administered by the EPA. It affects all the Chesapeake Bay area watersheds or states within the watershed. And in effect is a mandate down to the states of saying, we must meet certain limits under what is called a total maximum daily load, TMDL is the acronym, of certain inputs, phosphorus, nitrogen, total suspended solids. So this total suspended solids are the soil particles, and soil particles have a charge they carry with them, and they attract all kinds of stuff. So that soil entering into the stream system is what is then leading to pollution in the bay. And what the EPA has asked all the states to do individually is we've set limits on these things for your states. And then the states then look at the county levels and kind of just continues to push itself down. The EPA isn't necessarily stating you need to do X, Y, and Z to meet these standards. They're just saying you need to meet these standards. So the big push obviously is to reduce the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the total suspended solids. It has a cumulative effect so that the small order streams, as they then feed into the larger streams that then feed into bigger streams that then feed into the major tributaries, as that water moves across the landscape and is picking stuff up and depositing it into the water, there's that accumulation that continues to go on. And then by the time you're talking about the Potomac, the Susquehanna, you have those plumes of pollutants that are are filtering into the bay. Well, all of this stuff is built on models, and inherently models simplify complex things. But the models themselves have that we use, EPA uses then to track how this stuff is captured in a landscape, has a whole bunch of different practices that go along with it, like grass filter strips, no-till drilling, of course, and riparian buffers. The list is long, but within each of those, there's a lot of math and calculations that have gone on to say these practices capture X, Y, Z of nitrogen or phosphorus or the sediments. And what has been shown, like things like Agnes was talking about with Stroud, that does a lot of that applicable real world research, among many other bodies of research work, is that per unit cost invested, riparian, preferably woody riparian vegetation adjacent to the stream has the biggest bang for the buck. So putting in a riparian buffer captures all kinds of sediment, and in turn that sediment that remains on the terrestrial component of the watershed then immobilizes the phosphorus and nitrogen, or at least then slows its input into the streams. So that is why there is a big, big, big push to continue to do riparian buffers. From an administrative perspective, it's a lot easier to put in a few tree buffer practices as opposed to dozens and dozens of other practices that would need to be put in to capture the same number and level of sediment. And so this WIP program has been broken into 3 phases, and we are into the 3rd phase now with a target of 2025. So as I was just mentioning, that whole aspect of investment of resources versus return on that has created this very, very high interest and demand from funding agencies to further continue outreach and tree buffer establishment. And so it's been captured through a number of planting programs that stretch across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Some of these are at the federal level. So from New York all the way down to Virginia, we're talking about the same kinds of programs. Others have other programs that are local to the states. And within that, you have maybe partner nonprofit partnerships that are going along with this, or as standalones where they've generated, they're reaching out for funding from the U.S. Forest Service. But with all of these, and it varies a little bit, but there are landowner obligations. So some of the federal contracts in particular, if they're receiving compensation and cost share for the practice installation, then they have a greater burden to make sure that that is meeting performance standards versus some of these other programs. So the architecture for these plantings, and as I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, is that as a forester, we write a lot of management plans and we write a lot of planting plans. And within them, we outline numerous attributes of the property. We look over existing site conditions, obviously lay out what we want to have done. And we really can then distill the entire practice or the entire plan down to one page, which is a management maintenance practice schedule that synthesizes the entire document into one tidy page. Accompanying it, we have maps that outline soils, as well as the planting units and specific instructions. And so the maps in a plan are obviously meant to be cross-referenced as a guide, not just for the planting establishment, but for the ongoing maintenance and even the site prep before a seedling is even planted into the ground. So I had mentioned briefly that some of these programs will require certain performance standards expressed as either a % survival or some minimum stocking density of trees per acre. And there may be, for some states, there are payouts of the cost share are done over several years, and it's based in part on angle of the tree shelters, how well the depth of the root collar and the seedling have been planted. So maintenance plays a big role into ensuring to the landowner that they're meeting their contractual obligations, as there might be financial penalties levied if they're not in compliance. So it's interesting, though, that we have talked a little bit about how much of a demand there is from the funding agency perspective, but that same demand is not felt then in the private sector with private landowners. In the East Coast, most of our land that is in private ownership. So if we're going to have any kind of long-term and large-scale meaningful contributions to conservation, it has to be done through partnering with private landowners. The West is a whole different beast. Most of that land is in public ownership, and large-scale forest management can be done much easier. So looking at this is, why do we have some of these barriers to landowner enrollment? Now, some of it goes back to what I was talking about to begin with some of those contractual obligations. Some landowners I work with, or I know colleagues that work with, they don't want to be burdened with a long-term contract. When we're talking about some of these federal programs, it's 10 or 15 years with options to renew for another 10 or 15 years. And while they maybe are pretty interested in reforesting, they're not interested in a long-term obligation where they can't necessarily pretend what will happen. And then another interesting thing, which is certainly not anything that is unique to Maryland, is that there are demographics at play here. So I work with lots of older landowners that are very aware of their mortality or their longevity as agricultural producers. So out of that recognition, and many of these have been long-term participants in lots of other cost share programs, as they come to the twilights of their career, have reconsidered on burdening the next generation with assuming a contract that, while they may initiate it, they will not likely be the owners or operators that would then see the end of it. And this is a combination of, maybe it's staying within the family, but the children are not interested, or maybe their children are no longer interested in carrying on that tradition. So there's some uncertainty there. But the big thing comes back overwhelmingly now to maintenance. This has become the #1 issue with landowners in terms of their hesitancy to pursue these programs. A lot of these programs have been around for a considerable amount of time. When they first came out, I don't think that there was thinking that this was going to be a long-term, many of these were going to be long-term programs, but throughout the Bay, there's been a lot of bipartisan support at the state and federal level across both sides of the aisle for these programs. And so because they've been around and word of mouth can be the best or worst advertising, lots of producers that have gone through some of these things and have learned lessons the hard way have passed those lessons on to their neighbors. And their neighbors have seen how much of a time sink this can be. And that is where we are in the crux of really this conversation and moving forward, is that what can we do to help alleviate that? And if we start to look at some of the financial aspects, this is just generic. If we're looking at a planning plan and we would then break out our costs appropriated between some of these categories, what we see are a majority of the costs are then designated to the materials and labor, which makes a lot of sense. And then maybe a little bit to site prep, but we look to maintenance, and that has historically been had little contribution. Now, some of that's a reflection of the way that things used to be, and I'm going to talk about how things are now. So there is some reflection on that maintenance cost that it's just a reality that there's always a lag with some cause and effect. And I think we're now on the cusp of enough foresters, enough natural resource managers have been singing the same tune for long enough that I think that there has been a change in some of that perception. There things that have become available to landowners in some of these programs where funding then is built in. It may not offset all of the costs, but it helps alleviate some of these things. Or some programs are offering maintenance included at no cost to the landowner. Now, they may not be getting rental payments, or they may not be having any other kind of financial compensation other than, our own time is worth our own money. And then there's a temporal thing. We can't just necessarily now plant this and walk away. We used to be able to even do this with silvicultural harvests, where we could put in a silvicultural prescription and just trust that our advanced regeneration would then recruit into the sapling and mid-dominant canopies. And some of those successful trajectories are no longer a guaranteed thing. And so there is a time of a planting establishment that I give a general ballpark window of 3 to 5 years for landowners I'm working with that are interested in potentially entering into these programs. It's a general rule of thumb. It can be less time or it can be more time, and it is somewhat site specific. And so we have what we have are two opposite trends, where we have an interest driven by that the model outputs of installing riparian buffers, but landowners short on time or short on capital or short on both, not interested. But against all of that, there I would say have been some awakenings within the funding bodies or some of our nonprofits that say, look, this is becoming a reality and a significant barrier that needs to be addressed. And this is where I find that this is a very timely conversation. One of the gentlemen I work a lot with in the nonprofit sector, he and I were having a conversation. And I had mentioned that Jonathan had reached out to ask me to give a talk actually just specifically on maintenance, and was very glad to see that, this is getting the kind of attention and press that it is, and that there is definitely a market demand for this. And for those of you in the private sector considering going into this work, there's certainly more and more opportunities, because most of these programs are coming with several years of funding guaranteed. There's only so much a single contractor can do in terms of planting and then promising to be able to do 3 years of maintenance. So, and now we start to get into some of the threats that will face most plantings in most parts of the Chesapeake Bay, because certainly if you build it, they will come. And what are these threats? Well, they vary, and we're going to touch base just quickly on these. These are obviously not an extensive list. These are the ones that I have found, at least in the mid-Atlantic region, primarily in Maryland, to be the primary threats. Of course, if you're planting along a primary or a larger tributary, there could be flooding issues, or larger streams could have beaver problems. But by and large, these are the 5 threats that I have found to be most problematic. And for anyone considering getting into this, is something that is going to be something that you would need to pay attention, pause with. And we start with deer. For most that aren't aware, it's an interesting story that as we neared the turn of the 20th century, we had almost eliminated this from the United States. Now it's nothing to look out a window and see many head of deer. But the changes in land use between this pastoral, I work in Carroll County, so there's a lot of farms, but then woodlots. And so you have cover and food. And then you have a change in conservation and management of wildlife. But our present day estimates are really beyond what we could consider the carrying capacity of the landscape, and varies depending on where you are in the state or where you are in the region or within the watershed. But deer are a problem. And how are they a problem? Well, some of it is browse damage that we can address with shelter height. Another problem, though, is fleet of foot as they are, when they get startled, they will just try to go from point A to point B as fast as possible. And oftentimes what happens, we have broken or leaning shelters. And left to its own devices, those trees don't really necessarily correct themselves in a way that lends to long-term stability. So there's this is a younger tree that has suffered either a broken stem or broken stake, or it has a deer's hit it. But either way, the tree has done what is called rearticulating, where it's trying to then just get pointed in the right direction, but it's got an awkward bend. So that's a smaller tree, but this is a much larger tree, and we see the same problem persists. That has probably a basal caliper of 6 to 7 inches. And trees growing at 90 degrees are normally not what we have in mind when we are trying to get plantings established along streams. So solutions are, some are pretty easy. Hunting pressure is strongly encouraged, although trends in hunting demographics are not trending in the positive direction. With terms of limiting the browse damage, 5-foot shelters we have found have alleviated that problem, where maybe some of the lateral branches, the branches that grow out to the side, are sacrificial to the terminal branch. As long as the terminal, the primary leader that comes straight out of the tube, as long as that can continue to grow upwards, then we are on, then that will continue to grow and grow, and eventually the leaders will be on the deer browse range. There's a couple of tree shelters that I can't necessarily say those are the ones that I have worked with, and I say that I've had good luck with them. There's other tree shelters out there. I'm sure other foresters or other natural resource managers, or Matt might have his own preference, but these are the ones that I have found to be the most maintenance free for works on projects that I have had to do. And of course, it consists of a wooden stake, typically a 1 inch by 1 inch, reversible zip ties, and then bird nets. And we're going to talk a little bit more about bird nets in a little bit. But then we have another little animal that's called vole. There's a few different species of these. They're called meadow mice, but they are, as I refer to them, lunch on 4 legs, because a lot of animals like to eat these things. And through at least most of the year, they're not a threat to the plantings, as they're eating berries and leaves through most of the growing season. But as late fall sets in and we hit winter, they then switch over to a primary woody diet. And they obviously seek refuge in the shelters. They can reproduce prolifically. And the impacts really that stem from this, as they switch over to this woody diet, is that certain species will actually tunnel from under the ground, eat the root system. Others will just bite them off at the base and girdle them, almost like a miniature beaver in action. So there are, and that highlights, I'm not sure how well that stood contrasted, but that was a seedling that was a couple of years old that was actually in a 6-foot shelter, and it survived everything except, well, there was a mower involved as well, but this was actually done by a vole. Solutions. This is where maintenance becomes extremely important. They've done behavioral studies and have found that wider diameters the wider the diameter, the safer whatever's in the center of that diameter of cleared vegetation is. Minimum of 3 foot is what I use on all the plantings that we do in the state of Maryland. And because of they recognize the very fact themselves that they are lunch on 4 legs. So they're very wary about exposing themselves and leaving cover. Shelter inspection is a good way they'll start nesting, mid to late summer into the fall. So destroying the nests is a proactive way to inhibit large litters. I've had landowners that have installed hawk perches to encourage predation with natural means. And rodenticide is an option, although there's a lot of risks that come with that, both to the applicator. Most of that is stuff you have to be certified. Of course, there's non-target effects from that. When they go off to die, stuff that consumes them can also suffer from the same effect. And then we have non-native plants. So if we can think of, again, like another pie diagram where we have limited growing space occupancy. So you can only have a certain amount of plants to occupy for land, water, and other limiting resources. So this is actually a patch along the Monocacy River of, unfortunately, that's all Japanese hops. And the impacts varied by species, but in this particular case, they load the shelters, bend them down. That's obviously going to create deformities that are not, the trees are not able to rebound from that. There can be hybridization with some species, obvious displacement without any natural predators or pests. Non-native plants have a very distinct competitive advantage. And a lot of this can be done with some proper site prep, which is the steps taken before you even get to the point where you're putting seedlings into the ground. In areas where it's been prone to have some material or some species, we've done chemical treatments to then install a cover crop of, I've been using a clover fescue mix with actually a great deal of success. That limits the amount of mowing that needs to be done, but then occupies that growing space that would otherwise be going to those non-native plants. And then there's mechanical treatments like mowing, and then chemical treatments. If done on a consistent basis, then that becomes a pretty manageable task. Neglected, it becomes an issue. And bird nets, they're pretty self-evident. So when done right, they have the desired effect. The purpose is really meant to discourage birds from going into the tree tubes. There are some like bluebirds that have this cavity fetish. So in principle, this works. There are some impacts from it, plastic pollution, but then we get into these other things where if they aren't removed in time, what you get is this bundling effect of the tree. Now this might be correctable, but you get to a point, if this isn't addressed soon enough, you then have a problem where that distorted or deformation perpetuates as the tree continues to grow. So there are obviously that growth or that threat is most evident in the first few years of maintenance. And on public lands where we're involved and I'm out there doing the work, as we're out there a couple of times, 3 or 4 times a growing season, just taking a quick walk through after all the work has been done, and then just quickly pulling the bird nets down. The second that the trees start to get closer to the top or just starting to peek out like that silver maple. And then mowing, if done properly, helps reduce the competing vegetation and impair vole habitat. Distracted mowers, however, can end up mulching plastic and heavily pruning or taking out some trees. There was actually a planting that we had done almost a month's worth of maintenance work. And then the parks came in to do some mowing, and I was there and I was watching as the guy while he was driving, dropped something on the floor of the cab of his tractor. And as he sat there to try to get it, yanked the wheel and ended up running over a good part of a row before he could get everything squared away. So in the blink of an eye, that was a unfortunate set of circumstances. So some of this is going to be redundant with what I'm about to talk about, but you can avoid a lot of this by being proactive in the planning for equipment turnarounds and maintaining the spacing. The plantings that we often do are done on a grid of either 10 foot or 12 foot on center. So as long as that is a straight line, there shouldn't be problems. It becomes an issue when they start to either pinch in or pinch out. And I advise against using weed mats, which is, some people love these things and swear by them, but I've found they're nothing more than another source of pollution and increased source of maintenance headaches. And so this ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is just following the laws of the 7 Ps, where it's proper performance. And I'm sure you guys can fill in the rest. But this is an example where we have about a 1/4 acre of what is going to be a conifer section. And the rest is a hardwood planting. So we lined on some fabric, landscaping fabric. I'm going to throw wood chips onto it. This isn't going to be something that's possible on a larger scale project, but in smaller settings like this, the intent then is we don't have to worry about getting herbicides close to the seedlings. And when we're doing mowing, we're just going right down the rows, and it limits us having to worry about mowing down trees. Because this is a common problem when people are using conifers and you don't use shelters. Even when you're using flags, those quickly get swallowed up by the other vegetation. And there's been more than one project that I've been involved in with a landowner with good intentions ended up mowing over all of his conifers. So this is a little bit of extra elbow grease up front, but pays for it on the back end. This is what I cannot stress enough. One, knowing your audience, your clients, so that you have an ability to talk and connect with these people, but also then reaching out with your state and county foresters that work in these areas. I mentioned that some of the federal programs may stretch from New York to Virginia, but those interpretations between the states can be a little muddied, and actually within the state between counties is not necessarily always interpreted the same. So by understanding how these programs are implemented is going to make it easier for you to do the job well, for you to give accurate bids, and it then allows you to understand some of these cost share logistics, because I've seen this a lot where landscapers are trying to jump over into some of this more natural landscape or natural reforestation work, and the costs of landscaping don't carry over into this world. So there's the scale, the costs, and the wages and all that stuff. None of it's the same. And so the guys might do great work, but their bids competitively exclude them from opportunities. And then knowing your soils. There's a web soil survey is a free online resource. It's a website that's done actually by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. You can either using, depending on if you use other GIS software or navigation software, you can import to delineate where your planting is, or you can delineate it just by drawing polygons. And it'll bring up more information than you ever want to know about soils and the soil, including their chemical and physical properties. But that'll help you in terms of sourcing the right equipment or knowing what stuff to bring there. Because you don't want to bring wheeled vehicles to wetter sites. Tracked vehicles are kind of the way to go. And obviously, know your species. That obviously helps with understanding growth strategies. That helps alleviate misidentification. And we're putting the right plants in the right spot. And I think I might have gone over a little. I apologize, Matt, but I'm going to turn this back over to Agnes now.
So Matt, you're up next. If you want to share your screen, go right ahead.
Okay, let me get her set up here.
That's great. That was a great concept that you were talking about there with the deers and the voles. That was great. And then now Matt's going to come in with a little bit of the business angle on things. I liked how Jamie was talking about talking with the landowners, and he talked about cost and stuff. So Jamie's is going to Matt's going to complement that so nicely here now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk much more simply than what Jamie was going over as far as just maintenance and how to establish a successful tree planting. This could be for buffer project or for just a reforestation project or something like any kind of large scale tree planting where you're trying to reestablish wooded cover. And basically from a contractor's standpoint and just go over some, what we do and how we do things. And it seems to be pretty successful so far. I'll probably cover some of the things that Jamie already said, but I'll try to breeze past them a little bit and just add anything that I can. He covered a lot of that stuff pretty clearly. So basically, and I haven't done one of these webinars before, so bear with me. I'm just kind of going off cuff here. If you have any questions when we're done, anything I don't cover completely or something I'm not clear on, just let me know in the comments or the questions, and I'll try to answer what I can. So let's see. So for a successful tree planting, you need to have site preparation that's site specific, vegetation control, and in the long term, tree and tree shelter maintenance. So if you kind of neglect any of these things, you're gonna have a failure. And we like to do the maintenance on these tree plantings for a minimum of 3 years, but from what I've found, 3 years is really not enough. Now, some sites will take off and you're able to minimize the amount of work that you have to do each year, but I still think, especially with the amount of invasives in the landscape, that you really need to continue maintenance on these sites for a number of years past, more than 3. And again, it's all going to be site specific. So the first thing you want to do when you have your site selected is start looking at what you have to do to prep the site for planting. And this is going to be different on every site. Some sites be maybe just, an old cornfield, or some sites might be turf, could be parts of a golf course, could be an old, I don't know, pasture or something like that, or it could be, a completely overgrown mess, which is still a viable planting if you take the time to do the right amount of site preparation. So one of the methods for getting a site ready for planting when you have an overgrown mess like this is you can either subcontract, or if you have the ability to run the equipment, you can rent machinery that will do this. Is forestry mulching. So forestry mulcher, which is what was in the previous slide, will take down pretty much anything up to 3 or 4 inches in diameter. And a lot of times in these heavy invasive covered areas, you're going to get some invasive trees in there that you want to get cut down as well. Now, when you do mulch, just keep in mind that you're only grinding this stuff down to ground level, and it's going to come back. There's going to be resprouts, but we like this as a method because it avoids a lot of chemical use when you can, get rid of the above ground part of the plant, and when it sprouts back, treat that instead of broadcast spraying. So that's the same site before and after. We had a forestry mower in there. And that site there, ideally what you would do is you'd come back in after you gave it some time to start coming, resprouting, and then do a herbicide treatment. And again, you'll have to use a lot less chemical than if you were to try to spray beforehand and kill everything. So the other, if you're at a site that you don't really need to do forestry mulching, something that's not as heavy as that, maybe it's just grass or some brush or something like that, you can use just a regular brush mower. You're going to want something that has heavier duty, like a bush hog or something like that. The goal is to get the site so that your planting is as easy as possible. You're going to be ideally you're putting in a lot of trees, so you don't want to be dealing with knee-high grasses and things like that. You kind of just have everything mowed down and laid out, and then ready to plant and get in and out as quickly as possible. Now, some sites you're going to run into, like on the left here, they're pretty wet. So especially in buffer areas, So a 4-wheel drive tractor would be ideal. And I, definitely recon the area before you go in there, so you're not dealing with pulling equipment out of, wet mud holes. The second, the third thing you want to do, or the second thing after you do the mechanical control, is you want to get in there and really, if you have a site that has invasive species that are going to cause you issues with your planting, you want to get in and control them beforehand. I mean, there's fighting amongst, trying to kill things amongst things that you don't want to kill. It's, it becomes a real hassle. So if you can get in there and really knock back the vegetation that you're trying to control, I mean, you don't want to nuke everything, but you can, it'll save you a lot of headaches in the future if you do that beforehand. Now there's, selective and non-selective herbicides. Obviously, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with a lot of the specifics with a herbicide. Just make sure if you're, just make sure you're selecting the herbicide that you want to use carefully. You're trying to, avoid killing grasses, go with a selective herbicide, something that's, only going to affect broadleaves. But really, if you're not concerned with that, a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate or something like that is cheap, effective, and works on just about anything. Spot spray, I would recommend, if you have your site laid out, to spray each planting location beforehand. If you can get in there like, a couple weeks before you plant, at least, that's ideal. Then you have, a spot that's basically, there's no vegetation there. You're able to get the tree in. It's a head start. And then overall control, anything that's along the edge, anything that could be a seed source, come into your planting, you want to try to control that as much as you can. This is a tree that was, I think this was in a planting that was, it was an older planting. It was a pretty large tree, but this was a tree that was girdled by a bittersweet vine. I mean, that's one of the few of the vines that will actually do this, but it's very abundant in the landscape. And once you get an infestation of this, it's hard to control. It spreads by mainly it has a berry that birds carry. You'll find that this will be growing out of the tubes in your planting site. The birds like to perch on the edge of the tube and drop the seed right in there. Next, when you're selecting your planting stock, you do have some options. I guess it depends on whether you're working within a budget or if there's a specific planting plan that you're trying to stick to or that is specified. There may be some, specific sizes that are called for. A lot of times you can go with smaller stock and do a higher density, or go larger with a lower density. That's going to be something that you have to decide based on the budget for the project. Potted material, you can get anything from 1 to up to 25 gallon material, but really for planting of reforestation and riparian buffers, you're looking at stuff around 2 to 3 gallons. You have a longer planting window with potted material. You can you can start, basically you can plant pretty much anytime the ground isn't frozen, and really the window kind of ends the end of spring and opens up again at the end of summer. I mean, you could plant in the summer if you were able to water, but really that's going to be not cost effective. So you stick to your windows of Basically, after, I'd say, after October, mid-October is best. And then really anytime the ground is not frozen, we try to keep our window from mid-October to mid-December, and then open it back up again mid-March to maybe like the 1st of May. For planting this, especially for large scale plantings, you're going to want to have some sort of equipment with an auger or something like that, because you can hand plant these, but it can get, I mean, it can be overwhelming when you're trying to hand plant, 1,000 of these things. The other option is bare root, which is cheaper. Your window is much smaller. You have to plant these when they're dormant and when they're available from the supplier. They pull them. The supplier will pull these specific times of the year. And you have to be able to get a hold of them and get them in the ground as quickly as possible. The roots have to be kept moist. You can use like a root dip or something like that to assist you with that. I would definitely consider root pruning. When you do plant these, most of the time you're going to be using a dibble bar or something like that in your hand planting, so you're creating a small slit in the ground. And as you can see here, I mean, these things have a lot of roots, so you don't want to be stuffing all these roots down in a small hole. There's specific guidelines which it's fairly easy to find for planting these things. You want to avoid where the root kind of goes down in the hole and comes back up the other side of the hole, which is like as if like you're stuffing it down in there, and that is that's a deep that will cause issues, and eventually the tree will die. So you want to make sure that the roots are kind of spread out, facing down, and not, they call it J-rooting. They're not, sticking out of the ground. And it's something, it's definitely a technique. You want to make sure you're also planting, you're not burying the root collar. So you got to be able to recognize where that is on the tree. And from there, let's see. And again, you can get these from anywhere, depending on how many you're getting, from 50 cents a piece up to, a couple dollars a piece, depending on where they come from, versus the potted material, which you're looking at, $10 to $25 each, depending on the size. Be wary of where you get your planting stock from. This is some stuff that we got from fairly cheap, and it came, I mean, you can see the issues here. That tree is probably, I'm 6 feet tall, so it's probably a, almost 10-foot tall tree in a tiny little 1 gallon equivalent there. And then there's, that's fairly root bound in these 1 gallon containers. Luckily, we were able to get some of discount on these, and the labor it cost us to prune these out. They did okay, but you don't want to have to be dealing with this. So make sure you're getting your stuff from somebody who's, going to get you quality material. So, hand planting and machine planting. Basically, the hand planting is going to be for the smaller material. Again, you can carry the bare root material. You're going to be able to carry, 50, 60 of those with you while you're going along and planting each location. So that's an advantage. And the larger material is harder to handle, but again, there's a longer window and you have more potential for success with those on for each tree. So tree protection is an absolute must. you're not really going to have a successful tree planting without tree protection. You can see this picture came off the internet, but it was, that's just completely browsed. The deer are relentless. And this other picture up here, that's a tree that was rubbed. We planted and ran out of daylight and left without several of our trees being sheltered. And one night we came back, and that's what several of them looked like. So it doesn't take long for them to do the damage. So for tree shelters, you have the tube type, which is what I recommend. There's a ton of different suppliers. You want to, basically you're just going to have to work it out, the budget or your job of, who you go with to get the tube. And most of them, they all kind of function the same. There's just advantages with some over the other. They create like a mini greenhouse effect, which is supposed to promote growth in the tree. And they also protect the tree from herbicide when you're out there spraying around them. That's a big advantage. And it protects the tree from deer, from rubbing and browse. You have to go with a 5-foot tube, though. I see them selling these smaller ones. I'm not really sure what they're for. I've never seen much success with anything less than 5 feet. For some reason, deer just at 5 feet, it's like I don't know. It's like they can't reach it, or they're lazy or something. A 4-foot shelter, I'll find the trees that are coming out at the top of it are just browsed. It's like there's nothing there, and it creates a weird looking, that doesn't necessarily die, but it just, it ruins the form of the tree. The 5-foot shelters, they don't seem to bother. Occasionally you'll get something here and there. They do sell 6-foot shelters. That might be a little overkill, but again, site specific. So if you're having issues on a site that's nearby, you might consider going to a 6-foot shelter. They're supported with a stake, usually 1 to 2 inch. We have some contracts that we use 2 inches. I'm not really sure that you're getting much more longevity out of a 2-inch stake than you are out of a 1-inch stake. And the zip ties that come with the tubes are, they're kind of designed for the 1-inch stake. So you're going to have, it's going to cause, take more time to put the tubes on a 1-inch stake. You're fiddling with zip ties. They're not long enough. It's I would just, if you have the option, just go with a 1-inch stake. You can always replace it. It's pretty much half the price of a 2-inch stake, and you're not getting twice the longevity out of it. You're going to want to remove these eventually, but the tree has to be at least, I say 3 to 4 inches in diameter. It should maybe even bigger. The tubes are supposed to be perforated, so that when the tree gets to a certain size, it snaps the tube, and it's able to continue expanding and grow. But at the same time, you want the tree to at least be large enough that the deer aren't going to really rub on it. And that, I've seen deer rub on a lot. Some trees that I'm confused as to why they would be rubbing on those particular trees. They're fairly large, but I always kind of see it on trees that they're able to kind of push them around. It seems to be, somewhere in the 1 to 1.5 inch seems to be the size that they like to scrape on the most. So at least let the tree get almost to the size of the tube before you worry about removing the tube. And then again, like Jamie mentioned with the bird nets, we try to avoid them really, because Again, it can cause form issues if the tree, sometimes you'll see these trees and they just, the growth explodes, and by the time you get back to the site, it's already, the top growth is already kind of deformed because of the bird net. And I've really, the time I've spent doing this, I've only a handful of times ever run into a dead bird in one of the tubes. So, I mean, I'm sure it happens, and I'm sure there's a reason for it, but I just, you can avoid it, I would. Other types, which I'm just go over quickly because they are, it is a potential that you could use. There's possibility to use these. I don't really recommend them because, well, I'll speak to that. So there's, you can use deer fence that's cut and staked and put around the tree. And then you can also use, they sell these hard mesh types, and you can get them in different sizes as well. The hard mesh it's hard to find them at 5 feet. So we usually, we will use those on larger stock that's, at least where the tree is at least 6 feet at that point. And then the deer fencing has to be cut, which, that can be time consuming and a pain. Some property owners like this. There's certain situations where the planting is in maybe a high visibility area and they want something that doesn't look like tree tubes everywhere. I mean, that might be the case for using that. You're going to have issues potentially with herbicides when you're spraying, because a lot of these planted trees will have a tendency to put off root sprouts, and if you start hitting those, you may not kill the tree, but you're going to definitely inhibit growth. And if you do it enough, you may actually kill the tree. They do say that the net is supposed to allow for more movement of the tree. It creates a little more lateral strength. You will see sometimes when these trees are in the tube, they'll grow up real fast, and then they're unable to support their own weight, and really unable to support the weight of a tube and maybe a broken stake. So again, maintenance is the key, not just for mowing and spraying, but exclusionary fence. Sometimes people ask me about that. I mean, that's expensive. And if you get one break in the fence, all your trees a tree falls down and knocks, part of the fence down, and every tree in there is going to be, free for the pickings. All right, so now we'll go into some maintenance. We've got 22 minutes, so I'll go a little faster here so we can finish up in minutes or so. So pre-emergent treatment is an option. This is a herbicide spray that you put down prior to seed germination. This can give you a head start, and you can prevent some of these annuals and even perennials from getting a foothold in your planting. It's mainly used in strips along the tree planting. You don't want to just spray this everywhere, but it means mainly around the trees for the tree rows. It's got to be put in very early in the spring, and needs to be watered in. So really on sites where the large scale plantings like these, that's going to be the rain. So you want to be able to time this so you can get some rain on it. It acts as a barrier. And then post-emergent treatment. This is the most common. This is what we use. We either do strips or spot spray around the tree. And kind of want to time this maybe 2 times a year: early summer, early fall. Early summer will give you, if you use glyphosate or something like that, it's going to give you most of the summer. It'll be clear. And then in early fall, you'll be able to, anything that's coming up, you'll be able to kill that so that you have bare ground over the winter. Again, rows or spots. And also while you're doing that, you want to hit any invasives that are colonizing planting area. So again, you're controlling the competing vegetation around each tree. There's only a finite amount of water and nutrients, and the plants that are growing around the tree are sucking up some of that. So if you eliminate those, it's more for your trees. And it eliminates cover for voles and any other rodents that might want to eat your tree. They don't like, they don't like being exposed. So, and again, preventing invasives from coming in the area. You can use a spray rig, or backpack sprayers are okay too, a little more. If you like to walk, you can go up and get your steps into the day. Follow the label carefully. I'm not going to give you specific herbicide recommendations, but just make sure you follow the label. There's a story of a lady that a friend of mine told me, where she was complaining about how expensive Roundup was, and she wasn't diluting it. She was just spraying it without any dilution at all. So make sure you're make sure you're following the label, and double check when you do it. If you're on a site that's wet, make sure you're only using aquatic approved herbicides. I wouldn't even, it's really for streams, ponds, anything close to that, anything that appears to be a wetland, that's kind of regulated. You got to make sure that you have an aquatic approved herbicide, and also make sure that you're not, you don't have to get any kind of permit to spray in a wetland area. Use all the required PPE. It's important. Long sleeve gloves, boots, safety glasses, it's all minimum. Watch for herbicide drift. You want to kill the stuff that's competing with your trees, but you don't want to hurt your trees. This picture, this tree here has been hit by herbicide sometime in the past, and you can see the deformed leaves there. Now it'll probably grow out of this, but you've knocked the tree back. It's not, you're not getting the growth out of it that you should. And pay attention to weather and climate conditions when you're spraying. You don't want to go out and spend an entire day spraying only to have it, rain that night. I don't know. It all depends on the herbicide and how rain fast stuff is, but just again, read the label and make sure that you're paying attention to weather, climate conditions, the wind. You don't want to be spraying when it's blowing 15 miles an hour or more, really low wind. And make sure you're recording, how much you sprayed and all that stuff that you're supposed to with your requirements for your license. Some sites you're not going to be able to use herbicides, or the property owner might request that you don't. Now that's going to be an uphill battle for you, but you can do other things like weed mats. These things tend to get mowed over and thrown all over the place. They can be labor intensive. They can, I don't see why voles wouldn't go under there and create a nest. So that could be an issue as well. And litter. So, if you're considering doing this for business, you're going to need some equipment. A spray rig. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. That this is what we started with. It's just a golf cart with an electric sprayer, and I think this was a hand-me-down from another contractor that helped us out when we started out, and this is what we started out with. So eventually, you want to get something 4x4, just because you're going to be on sites where you're going to need it eventually. Mowing, you're going to need a brush mower. Again, start out with something cheap. You don't need anything fancy. I think we started out with an old ratty tractor and a bush hog. Eventually, it'll get to the point where it's, breaking down on you too much and you want to get something new, but you don't have to start out with it. And then there are other options for tractors that have low center of gravity for hills. Some of these planting sites are going to be on some pretty steep hills, and you don't really want to be on some of these tractors on those hills.
Yeah, taking a tumble would not be good. Matt, I'm just taking note of the time. I'm seeing that it's at 8:15. So
I'm just about finished up, so I'll speed it up.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay, shelter maintenance. Again, this is key. You can see, I mean, all the time, shelters are down. Doesn't matter how many times you come to a site, and come 3 days later, there's going to be shelters on the ground. I mean, after, I would say after a certain amount of time, after 2 years, it just happens. You want to schedule that in there. You want to schedule your maintenance. I recommend 2 times a year, early summer, late fall. You want to get the vegetation, the dead vegetation knocked down towards the end of the growing season. Avoid mowing during heavy pollinator activity. If you're if there's a lot of wildflowers, we just want to avoid that. We're trying to create habitat. There's not invasives there. There's not a lot of, if you've got spray around your trees and it's bare ground, the rest of the site can, you can let it grow. And spray again 2 times a year. We try to do a 2-time year minimum. And do your shelter maintenance on each visit. So this is a site that was infested with mile a minute. These sites are going to require more work. You're going to have to visit more often. You're going to have to budget for that. There's trees under those fuzzy-knit looking things. And then some sites, you got wildflowers, you got, native stuff. You don't need to mow it as much. Let it grow. Keep a bare ground around your tree, and then just let the site grow. Consider planting a meadow if you have. I'll go through this real quick because this is kind of like, this is kind of extra. If you want to, you can seed, site prep and seed for wildflowers, meadow, pollinator meadows, stuff like that. You basically just site prepping, seeding, rolling. Hopefully you end up with something like that. And then other concerns, you're going to have voles. The far right at the bottom was just a tree that was just chewed up. The roots were completely chewed up by voles. Rabbits, you have tubes, they're not really going to be a problem. If you're planting a buffer and it's close to a stream, you're going to get flooding at some point in time. Make sure you're selecting your species if they haven't already been selected for you for the correct site conditions. Business concerns for insurance, if you're a landscaper or in that business, you should be covered. Make sure you're covered for equipment that you're using in the herbicide use, and you have the right workers' compensation category, which would be, landscaping, something like that. Make sure you have, for your state, if you're spraying commercially, you have a commercial pesticide applicator license. Every state's different. There's some reciprocity. You have to check in, make sure that you can, spray legally in that state. There's annual renewal, and there's continuing education every year for that. And there's categories. Just make sure you get a category that covers you for the maintenance, and including an aquatic category for buffers if you're somewhere close to a stream, and you want to make sure you have that category. So again, you're going to need equipment, mowers, bush hog, spray rig, backpack. You can consider renting, subcontracting even to get started, And for pricing, develop a plan and refine it as you go along, and track all of your sites so you know where you're making money, where you're losing money, and adjust. You're not going to be able to do it once you got the contract to do a job. You're not going to be able to change it, but you'll know for the future if you have decent records. We charge per acre, or we estimate our costs per acre. And for planting, you can estimate your cost per tree based on your, your supplier's costs and your labor costs. And it's going to be different with where, region to region. And just finishing up. This was a site that we started out. It was completely covered in autumn olive, which we did a ton of site prep on. We planted and sheltered, and that's what it looked like when we were done. So we're into year 2 on that now. I couldn't find any pictures currently, but it's coming along. Sorry for going over.
Hey, it's okay. It's okay. I'm just here to keep us in line. That's all. Matt, that was great. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen now as we get into the Q&A. But before we begin, I saw on your one slide there, you had multipliers. What multipliers did you want to, did I miss that part or?
Yeah, so what you want to do is, so what we do with some of our plantings, we use our materials costs, and we use multipliers to figure out our costs. And it's just an easier way to, instead of trying to come up with labor costs for each individual site, we'll use a multiplier of our materials costs. So you might say that, the site, depending on the site, it might be, 2 times the cost of your materials to get something purchased and installed. And then if you have to guarantee for a certain number of years, you want to add, additional money onto that, to make sure that you're covered for replacements, because you will have replacements most likely.
Okay. And that's a conversation then you incorporate in when you're talking with the potential client, potential multipliers. Is that?
Well, that's mainly for the business owner. That's for them. That's a tool, just, that's one of the tools they can use to give a price to a landowner that makes sense to the business owner. And then, without, if otherwise you'd be getting into every single site. Some of these, you can go in and for if you go to somebody's house and you're planting a tree, you might have a perfect idea of how much it's going to cost. But when you get to a site, and every site's, different, there's different landscape concerns, there's different site prep, there's different, access concerns, lots of different factors that you have to, so if you have a base multiplier and then you just add on to that, you can kind of get pretty accurate where you're not overcharging, but you're also covering yourself in case of, something down the road is going to cost you if you lose trees, or if, you have to do some replacements, or, you have a flood, or, like the one picture you might have, if you're next to a tree or next to a stream, and you might want to factor in that you might have, 1 or 2 occasions where you have to visit the site after a heavy rain event and fix a ton of tubes.
Right. Okay, great. So let's get into some of the questions. That was a question from me. Let's get in some of the questions that was in the Q&A, and I appreciate you guys putting the questions in the Q&A. Feel free to continue to put those in, and we'll do our best to get through them all. So you guys, foresters and landscapers in the crew here are being asked, what is the difference between a vole and a field mouse? I don't know the difference between a vole and a field mouse. I don't know if any of our partnership, Woods in Your Backyard partnerships do, but.
Well, I mean, they look kind of the same. A vole is going to have a much shorter tail, and I mean, I always see them when I'm mowing. They seem to be a lot less agile than a field mouse, but that's always the concern is, I've learned, is that voles are the concern. they're the ones that feed on the roots and the base of the tree.
Okay.
I don't really know about field mouse, if that's a, you know, yeah, I don't know if they're really an issue with trees, but if you're looking to identify one, if if you're seeing them and you're planting, and they're going to be small, kind of chubby things with a much shorter tail than a regular mouse.
Good tips. Great, great. Okay, you guys, we have a question here. Have you ever tried Miyawak? Do you guys see that? Reforestation, Miyawaki, am I saying that right? Miyawaki reforestation, or is that prohibitive for large scale work? So Melissa, if you want to spell that out in phonics for me to read it correctly, I'd be happy to reread it. So that's question from Melissa at 7:43. If you guys are looking at that and you want to take another look. In the meantime, any thoughts about that? Do you know what I'm talking about, or should I go to the next question?
Well, I can answer that one.
Great, that's Julianne. That's
Because
Julianne.
we've tried to get a sample reforestation in some of our municipalities, because there was actually a grant involved in that. And it's a technique where things are planted very closely together to avoid invasives and such. And it is a technique developed out in Japan, as you can see by the wording. It is hard for large scale work. We were looking at a steep slope, holding it into place, but yet we have not gotten one off the ground. But yes, we're aware of it and hoping to get an example out there.
Yes, so that got brought up at the last session too, planting trees closer together so that, you know, deer and stuff can't go through, and then the trees self prune and stuff. Am I on the right track with that, Julianne?
Probably. I mean,
if others are working with that, trying that technique, I did not realize that was a technique. The name of that technique. Sorry, I did not realize that was the name of that technique. If anybody's using that out there and want to comment in the chat or the Q&A, please feel free. So our next question, moving us forward here, regards to EPA and riparian stream requirements, what size streams have to be in compliance in terms of EPA and riparian stream requirements?
This is Jamie. It's really not a specific size stream so much as the end result of where the samples are taken have to just meet those thresholds. So it's really a cumulative measurement of the entire watershed that gets drained is how that's getting measured. It's not necessarily stream by stream.
Great, okay. What treatment method do you use after forestry mower regrowth? So I overspray or basal stump. So I think that's in reference to that machine that Matt showed us at the beginning of his presentation. A good one for early success, creating early successional habitat too.
Yeah, so well, you're going to want to, so for the spray, I mean, the thing is, it kind of chews up the vegetation to the point where if you're not really getting a cut stump application that's effective. So what we typically do is we give it time to resprout, and then we come back and spray. So like just a foliar spray on the resprouts, and it may take, 2 or 3 applications for a large, we can mow down things like autumn olive bush that's, huge, is going to take some time to really kill that root system. There's other options with that too. And if you have we've been on sites where it's almost better just to pull them out of the ground with an excavator. They're so large, because then the roots just, they're just completely out of the ground. But for just a typical mowing, when you just have all kinds of stuff out there, just an overspray for the respawns.
Any other anything else?
Well, it's a better way to use less herbicide, that's for sure. I mean, if you're taking what would be a shrub canopy that'd be 10 to 12 feet, and you can get it down to your knees, it's a lot less herbicide. So it's another BMP practice that can be used.
And I love the idea, right when you showed that machine, Matt, I thought, geez, so if I'm a new business owner, I could rent that. And you mentioned that towards the end of your talk. So contractors can rent these machines, and where can we rent those machines? Does that affect our insurance if we're renting that machine?
So, yeah, I mean, you can, I don't really know on the insurance question. I mean, if you're covered for, work that includes equipment, then you should be fine. But you can rent them. They are hard. There is a limited number of places to be able to rent them, and they are fairly heavy, so you have to get them delivered. And then also, the price per hour can be pretty high. So, you're almost better subcontracting that work. I mean, and the equipment that they rent sometimes is not the best. It's been, kind of run down. So, I mean, typically, if you're doing a full 8-hour day, you might be able to rent the machine for, maybe $1,300 or $1,400 versus a contractor that's going to cost you $1,600 or $1,800. So, and the contractor is probably going to be faster with it, and it's not like a lawnmower where you can just go and run. You kind of have it takes a while to get used to and become efficient, but eventually you can get the hang of it. But I mean, but if you wanted to rent to learn how to operate the equipment and see if it's something you wanted to do, there's like just Bobcat dealers, and you'd have to search around. Okay. I know that the Bobcat dealer that we deal with, they do have a rental, but they float it around from their different locations. You kind of got to get it ahead of.
You know what? One of the things you said there was that they're heavy, and then I thought about the vehicle that I'm using. You said that it would get dropped off, and then I would have to take that maybe to a site or something. So how am I moving that around, or does it get delivered right to your site?
Yeah, they can drop it. They can deliver it right.
Fair enough. Fair. Any thoughts, Jamie?
No, it's always about the right tool for the job. So I'm a big proponent of that. If you try to use maybe just what would be considered like an ambush or a different attachment on a Bobcat, that you then have more time wasted because equipment break down. So, it's one of those, I don't have to deal with that stuff as much as when the contractors are, I equate it when I'm dealing with a contractor, like you're sitting down for a job interview. You don't want to oversell your capabilities. So, you shouldn't say you have something that you can do the job with and then show up and trying to patchwork something together that maybe isn't appropriate, because then the project just sits idle if the machines are constantly broken.
All right, good advice. This one's for Wright Environmental. What and if any guarantees does Wright Environmental provide? So that's an interesting question for the clientele you serve. Do you guys offer any guarantees?
Yeah, it usually depends on the contract. Like if we're working for a public agency on a planting, there may be a 2-year maintenance and survival contract. So, and that all depends on the plan. So some plans require 75%, some might be 80. It really all kind of depends on the density of the planting. Some some plantings are much more planted at a higher density, so they require less survival than others. So I find, I mean, I don't know, it seems the lower density and the higher survival requirement seems to, you know, work best for us as far as, you know, a business outcome, because we're able to use the money that would have been used for materials on the larger density planting and put that into maintenance. So we're, you know, so it all depends. We, a lot of times we'll guarantee for 2 to 3 years. So it might be an 80% survival requirement.
Oh, I hear what you're saying. So in that 2 to 3 years, 80% survival. Okay, great. Those
Right. So we'll go in and we'll count trees, you know, maybe once a year and see what, you know, what the survival percentage is. And most of the time we'll count every tree if it's, unless it's like a extremely large planting, but and then we'll come back and we like to do our, you know, our replantings in the fall.
Great, great, great to hear. So if you put any questions in the chat and it didn't get in the Q&A, please put any questions from the chat into the Q&A if you did that. I think we're on one of our last questions here. So are plantings done in the fall not watered after installation? How can the landowner water large scale plantings? So it sounds like 2 questions here, you guys. Are plantings done in the fall not watered after installation? Let's take this as a 2-parter.
Well, I mean, for us, it kind of, you know, we don't typically water our plantings. So, you know, for us, unless it's like, you know, a biblical drought or something, then maybe we'll go out and water. But typically for us, it's less expensive to replace the trees than it is to continually water throughout the year. So we kind of just, you know, let them, we put the trees in and we let them fend for themselves. We get to the best we can with them, but we haven't had, you know, that issue yet where it was that bad of a drought. Now we do a lot of larger trees, ball and burlap for, you know, other projects, and we do water those for sure, because the cost, you know, that tree is $150 to $200 tree, so we don't want to lose that. But yeah, so we don't typically water large scale plantings unless, you know, it's right after we plant.
Great. Jamie, you were going to pipe in there?
But really, I wouldn't be adding much more than what Matt offered. There is a distinction. I mean, fall plantings, if you do them early enough and they're a containerized stock, then there have been times, it's been mostly a twofold, where I maybe am taking people out to do some pumps training or something just for fire related work. But while we're doing that, we might as well just try and be productive with watering. That's fairly rare. And then there's bare root plantings. If they're done late enough after they've gone dormant, they can then, those don't need, we tend not to water those. But in general, these riparian buffers have some kind of buffer because of the soil types. Typically, these are situated either at the toe of slopes, or the soils are so poorly drained that even in the driest of dry times, there's typically enough soil moisture that the trees can persist. Now, if these stretch and you go up a hill, that's a little different story. But like Matt was saying, most of this, if you look at the itemized costs on plantings, it has to do with the shelters, the protective measures, and not actually the seedlings themselves. So provided the shelters aren't destroyed, then that doesn't take much time to lift the shelter off and put a new tree back in its place.
Great. So the second part in this question is, how can a landowner water large scale plantings? So I'm hearing now that maybe watering is not always necessary depending on location. Or do you have any advice for somebody that wants to water a large scale planting?
I mean, I would say, when we do plantings, you can get those cubes, the totes, 300, I think they hold 375 gallons. And we have a truck with a few of those that we use for watering. The watering itself isn't really the main issue. It's getting access readily available to be able to water. So I would say if the property owner dig a hole and see what the soil looks like. If it's powdery, then, you're probably, you would benefit from watering. If you have a pickup truck with a water tank, just fill it up and, give each tree a couple gallons. But for these large scale plantings, I just wonder how much that's actually doing. Like Jamie said, if these are seedlings, that you're getting for 50 cents, you're spending a lot of time, for where you can just replace the tree for, less cost.
Well, Matt, I thought you said something that I thought was really interesting to involve the landowner in when it comes to discussing maintenance with the landowner is, even just digging into the soil and having a look at it and talking about the soil type itself with the landowner to then talk about, that can be an introduction or a visual to talk with the landowner about possible maintenance, like you said, if it was dry or however you described it. That's a good segue into a conversation with the landowner. Jamie, did you want to add on to that? What Matt was saying?
Well, depending on the planting programs and how they're funded, there are oftentimes like acts of God provisions within it. And the reality is that these plantings aren't really set up from a cost share perspective for watering. If the landowner has the time and the desire, then some of them that are ag producers have readily accessible equipment like hay wagons and take the sides off and are able to do that. But by and large, if we get to that point where we're having such massive failures due to things that are outside of the scope of a landowner's responsibility for maintenance, there are built-in costs and provisions. And a drought is going to be a lot easier to deal with than actually a flood. Floods tend to take away the most expensive part of the plantings. So droughts are a lot easier to deal with. Replacing the shelters is problematic.
Mm-hmm. So I host walks in the woods every so often, and there's this landowner that had like Matt's that golf cart that he had for his herbicide spraying. There was a landowner that rigged a pretty good sized water tank on the back of his golf cart. And I know soil, like you don't want to get stuck in it, but very innovative. So you guys, that was the end of our Q&A. So I appreciate you guys being here. I hope you got Jamie's email address and Matt's email address if you want to contact them, talk to Jamie about some of those funding programs out there that are available, or if you want to talk to Matt and see how he got started. How did he do it? What are some of his successes? And maybe you can find out some tips. So our next one is next Tuesday. So next Tuesday is the beginning of Woodland Management Week. We are going to be talking about applying woodland health practices to different successional stages. We really appreciate that. I wanted to remind you of a couple things before we get going. If you did not get this manual that came with the checklist, please go to who you registered with and they will send it to you. Also, as you close out here, there's going to be a questionnaire upon exit. So if you could please fill that out, we'd really appreciate that. Again, your feedback means a lot to us. So with that, I hope to see you guys at our Woodland Management Week and on Tuesday, March 9th, starting at 7. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and taking the time out of your busy schedules for us. So we appreciate that, you guys. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.